Chapter 8. French Boots. As a boy, Nigel used to like going on long hikes with his family. One summer they climbed Old Man Coniston in the Lakes District, and another he and his father hiked Hadrian's Wall, from the Solway to the mouth of the Tyne, all 84 ancient miles of it across northern England. Though he had been deliciously weary at the end of a long day of hill walking, those hikes had been great adventures, memorable fun. The march to the front, though intensely memorable, was anything but fun. While horses and donkeys strained at their traces, pulling dozens of carts loaded with tons of ammunition and supplies for the front, Nigel and the rest of the soldiers of the Somerset Light Infantry did what infantry does, has always done, marched on their own 2 feet. 100 kilometers, 11 hours of marching each day, for 2 long and grinding days. At the training camp in Étaples, many miles from the front, the vague plumpa of artillery had sounded soft and benign, almost playful, the sound of teammates kicking the rugby ball in a scrum. With each weary tread, the sound changed, became louder, more visceral, more crushingly harsh, more penetratingly impossible to ignore. With each whistling launch, Nigel felt his pulse quickening. Then came a breathless interval of suspended waiting, followed by a gut-pounding eruption of exploding heavy ordnance. The closer they came to the front, another sound arose. Intertwined in each barrage of artillery was the mowing staccato of machine gun fire, serving as an irritable descant above the grinding basso continuo of the far bigger guns. There were times in that 2-day march when Nigel felt he had fallen asleep marching, only to be jerked to alertness by the next artillery barrage, forced to remember that it was nothing so tame as a nightmare. This was foot-blisteringly real. This was war. "What is that awful smell?" It was Parrot at Nigel's heel. "That'd be your tea," growled Spike, clearing his throat loudly and patooing a glob of phlegm at Parrot's boots. It was the most putrid stench Nigel had inhaled into his lungs in all his life. Chip's nostrils twitched, but he trotted onward at his master's side. The source of the stench Nigel would all too soon discover. As they neared the support trench north and west of Arras, Nigel nearly collapsed. Welcoming them to the trenches, the November sky darkened, and a steady drizzle now fell. Droplets of chill rainwater dribbled off the back rim of Nigel's tin hat and down his neck, seeping into the seams of his uniform. Surveying the battlefield for the first time, Nigel shuddered. Nothing he had been told could have prepared him for this. The front, a muddy, barren wasteland as far as his eye could see. Not only had men been killed in this war, many men, the very land seemed dead. It was the complete absence of green, of anything living, shrouded by a rending web of barbed wire obstacles. Where plane trees had once lined pastoral country lanes and bordered lush fields of wheat and sunflowers, in their place were shattered stumps and grotesque branches, clawing heavenward as if in futile supplication. "My feet," moaned Parrot. "They're killing me." "Shut up," growled Spike, giving Parrot a shove that almost knocked him into the mud. "Be glad you've still got feet." "Yeah, look at those blighters," said Lloyd. "Leave him be," said Nigel. Chips glared at Spike and gave a low growl, wiry hair on the back of his neck stiffening. "You keep that mongrel off of me," said Lloyd, a tremor in his voice. Narrowing his eyes, Spike looked appraisingly at Chips. Nigel had seen that look before, and it troubled him, but only a bit. Chips, more than any dog he knew, could take care of himself. Stretcher-bearers struggled toward them, picking their way cautiously in the mud, carrying the wounded, several men with sodden, bloodied bandages on their feet, or what had been their feet. There were a dozen like that, maybe more, and some with once white bandages across their eyes and faces, being led by their comrades. Nigel stared numbly, doing his best to quell the urge to turn about face. After the stretcher-bearers came a column of silent men plodding toward them, shoulders slumped, staggering, weary, staring with vacant eyes at nothing, stupefying shock etched in their countenance. These were the lucky ones, the survivors, the yet living men they had come to relieve. Nigel clamped his eyes shut and wiped a hand across his face. It was insanity, a world gone mad. They were marching to where these men had just come from. They were plodding to the place where these men had been mangled and crushed. One man did for an instant meet Nigel's eye as he passed. He was about Sergeant Ayre's age, and the numb anguish in his eyes filled Nigel with dread. Men, we have a task to do. Speaking to the 40 men in the platoon, it was Lieutenant Lewis's words, strained and weary, coming to Nigel's consciousness like the hollow voice in a poor telephone connection. Tonight we move into our new billet, cozy dugouts in a sector near Riez du Vinage, just there. He pointed to the east and north. Squad sergeants will give you your instructions and your duty assignments. We will march single file through a series of support trenches, said Sergeant Ayres to his squad, then along communication trenches that will take us to the fire trenches, our dugouts, and the front. Once at the front, Fritz is but a grenade toss away. All commands will be issued in silence, passed from man to man. He paused. We have a task to do. Stay alert. Keep your head down. And may God be with you. There it was again. Nigel's anxieties seemed to melt away with Sergeant Ayres' words, or at least to diminish so that his stomach did not feel hard like bone instead of flesh. Safety catches on. The order was passed man to man through the squad, 10 rounds in the magazine. There was an orchestra of metallic clicking as men loaded their Enfield rifles. The weapon is now loaded. At Sergeant Ayres' command, advance, the squad began slowly to move forward. Wallace in front of Nigel, Parrott behind. Watch your step and keep your heads down. Lined with sandbags, the support trench they entered was reinforced by rough-sawn timbers, covered by a patchwork of corrugated iron sheets. Walking in the trench was like walking in a fetid river of mud, forcing the men to spread their legs wide as they tried to find better footing along the edges of the trench pathway. Along the walls on either side of the trench were men from the same regiment, some on duty, rifles at the ready, but most idle in their dugouts and alcoves, idle for the moment. Nigel shivered as the cold water seeped into his boots and socks, the mud sucking at his aching feet with each tread. It was late afternoon, darkness approaching, and the artillery barrages seemed to have settled into only an irritated grumble, the machine guns erratic, as if the Germans were not certain about this war, at least not this soggy November evening. Nigel could not help observing the strange transformation that came over Wallace as they neared the front line. Glancing over his shoulder at Nigel, he grinned, the eerie evening light flashing on 2 jagged rows of teeth. He was smiling as if they were setting out for a summer afternoon picnic at St. James Park. In hushed whispers, Wallace became almost voluble. "At last," he hissed over his shoulder to Nigel. "At last what?" "War," said Wallace. "The real kind, being here so close to the Boche, the real ones, not them overstuffed dummies. These ones is real flesh and blood Boche. Them's the best kind." Shivering, Nigel made no reply. Wallace had not said this many words in all the weeks of their training. "It's what I signed up for," continued Wallace. "Killing Boche. It's what I've dreamed of for these 3 years. And here we are, at last." "Stand down," came the order, passed down from man to man as darkness fell. "At last, here we are," said Parrott, releasing the straps of his rucksack, the burden squelching into the mud. "I've never been so tired in my whole life." Whistling and blasting of artillery had fallen off to a distant rumbling, as if the Germans, just for the moment, were too busy making their dinner to carry on with the war. As evening fell, all was quiet, at least in the sector of the Western Front, near Riez du Vinage. The men of the Somerset Light Infantry dropped their kit and began settling into their regimental billet at the front, a series of dugouts radiating behind and beneath the fire trenches, a labyrinth entwining a labyrinth. Here, Nigel and his platoon had been ordered to stand down for the night. An old sweat sergeant, acting the role of a traffic bobby, directed them to their billet. "Straight away," he said in a husky whisper. "Then take a left at the coil of barbed wire, just there. Then sharp right at the French boots." Nigel blinked rapidly. "French boots, sir?" "Our boys took over this sector after the French," explained the sergeant. "Some slacker Frenchie didn't do a very good job of burying his mate now, did he?" "He's in them?" stammered Parrott. "The boots?" "What's left of him is," said the sergeant. Dread pressed down on Nigel like a steamroller on a roadway. He halted, a trickle of water seeping into his boots. Why wasn't he buried proper-like? The sergeant turned slowly, narrowing his eyes at Nigel. "You're new around here, aren't you? Let me tell you why. We're a tad bit busy in my neighborhood. Let the dead bury their own dead, as the good book says, don't you know?" "No, you don't know," stroking his chin, he eyed Nigel appraisingly. "Not yet. But soon enough, you'll know."